The days of going through a bunch of boring and repetitive tasks to build your next .NET microservice are gone. The new AI tools available today can generate new apps according to your requirements better than any template and can predict your next line of code with incredible accuracy. In this first part of a two-part series, I'll show you how to 10x your .NET Microservices productivity with ChatGPT. Let's start. Before we start coding, let's take a quick look at the scenario that we'll be covering today. And this scenario is all about matchmaking. So here we have one game player that wants to play with somebody else, right? Let's say for a game of chess, but he doesn't know of anybody else that he can play with, right? So in order to help him, we're going to be standing up a brand new microservice, let's call it the matchmaker, whose only responsibility is to match players together so that they can start playing some sort of a game. So having matchmaker allows Pixel Warrior to go ahead and say, hey, I want to play a game, right? I want to play a game. And so matchmaker will go ahead and just hold on into that request and just wait for somebody else to also come in and join to play a game. So eventually some other player comes in and says, hey, I also want to play a game. So at that point, matchmaker recognizes that he has enough players to play this game. So it creates or prepares what we call a match. And so in this match, we have these two players that are ready to go ahead and play. But unfortunately, it is not enough to just prepare the match for the game. We actually need some sort of a game that they can play, right? So we need a location that we can provide the players to go ahead and play. So for that, we're going to be standing up a brand new microservice that we're going to be calling the Game Manager, right? And Game Manager's purpose is to provision or to create these games that the players are going to connect to, right? So whenever matchmaker has some match ready to go, it's going to just somehow tell Game Manager that, well, I got a match, this is waiting for a game, right? And so Game Manager, based on that request, will go ahead and provision or create this game, right, at some IP address and at some port, right, that is ready to go. So Game Manager will go ahead and go back and say, hey, the game is ready. And here are all the details. And matchmaker will go ahead and add all of those details into the match, right, the IP address and port. And finally, it's going to return those details back into the client that both the players are using so that they can go ahead and start playing the game. Now, of course, we're not going to be provisioning any sort of game across this demo, but we will be provisioning both microservices and we'll see how they can interact to each other. We're going to simulate the part where we create the game, but we're going to see the whole interaction and see how we can actually prepare these matches so that the players can go ahead and start playing. So let's now jump into the code and see how we can implement these two microservices using .NET and some pretty cool AI tools. So here we are in Visual Studio Code, and I have opened my terminal in a brand new Hello AI directory, which is currently empty. And here's where we're going to be creating our projects today. And so the first microservice that we want to implement today is the Matchmaker microservice, right? And so for that, we can use the .NET CLI very quickly. We're going to just say .NET new, and then the template that we're going to be using is the web template, which is going to provision a pretty empty web application that's going to work just pretty well for what we want to do today. And then the name is going to be Matchmaker, right? So let's hit enter. Okay, so on the left side, you can see now we have our matchmaker project. And let me collapse this for a moment. We have our program CS. And then since this is a C# project, VS Code is detecting via OmniSharp that it is a C# project. So it's going to offer us to add a few other items. We're going to say yes. That's going to create that VS Code folder that just adds a few files that make it easy to build and debug the project in VS Code. And so at this point, we have to start thinking, okay, so how is that we're going to implement this microservice? And what's the requirement? Well, the requirement here is that, as we talked about before, we want to have some sort of endpoint where our players can invoke that endpoint, probably providing the player name, and then they want to get back some information about the match that they have been assigned to, and it should tell them if there is a corresponding player that they can play with, right? And maybe even the server details, right? So we could go ahead and try to start implementing this ourselves here, or we can use some cool AI tools so that to get assistance on the initial implementation of this REST API. So the first tool that I want to show you today is this one over here that is called ChatGPT. And you can think about ChatGPT as just as a chatbot that you can use to ask questions and get some answers, right? Now, the thing about this chatbot is that it's really, really powerful and it's able to answer pretty much anything that you want to ask to it. So in order to access this page here, just look for ChatGPT in your search engine. You'll be able to land into this page. And then in order to start using it, what you want to do is just go down into this button that has Try ChatGPT over there. Just click on that. That's going to ask you to register as a brand new user. If you're new, it is free. You don't need to pay anything to use it. And then you will be able to get started right away. Okay, now I'm going to close this, and I already did that step. So I am already in the UI for ChatGPT. And as you can see, it is a very simple chat interface where you can start typing whichever questions you have down here. You can see a few examples of questions that you may want to ask and a few restrictions that are happening at the time when I'm recording this video. Now, if you didn't know at all how to create a REST API with .NET or with C#, you could have started here by saying something like, how do I implement a REST API with C#, right? So you can just do that, and ChatGPT is going to go ahead and try to offer you one or a few ways in which you can go ahead and create a REST API from scratch, right? And from here on, I may be speeding up the video anytime ChatGPT is producing some of these answers, just because it can take some time depending on how much load the service has at any given point, right? So let's see what we get here. All right, so now we have our answer there. So let me scroll up a bit to see what we got. So clearly ChatGPT is telling us, well, yes, to implement a REST API in C#, you can use the ASP.NET Web API framework. Yeah, it's part of ASP.NET. And here are kind of the basic steps, right? So it's prompting us to use Visual Studio to create the application. You don't have to use Visual Studio. You could do it like we did it with VS Code, right? And then it says, yeah, define the API, add the controller, and then implement the controller actions over here, define the routes, and then return responses, and then you can go ahead and test it, right? It even provides us with a very simple example of a values controller that you may want to implement in your REST API. So that is handy. It's not exactly what we wanted, and that's the thing about ChatGPT. It will provide different answers depending on the context that you have or on what you want to do, right? So even if you try this right now, you may get a very different answer yourself, but it is just trying to give you some accurate answer for what you want to do. But it will get more and more accurate as you provide more information. So because of that, what we want to do, instead of just asking it to generate a REST API for us, we want to provide a very specific set of requirements of what we want to do. So I have prepared those requirements already here, and just so that you don't have to see me typing, I'm going to just paste those requirements right here and see what we get from ChatGPT. So the first thing that we're going to ask, I'm going to paste that over here, is that it should go ahead and implement a REST API in C# with a match endpoint, right? That takes a player as a string parameter and returns a game match with the two matched players. Okay, let's get even more specific than that. And then let's say that the method should try to find an open match for the player. And not just that, but also if there is no open match, it should create a new match with a specified player. But if there is an open match, it should just assign the player to that open match, right? So that's kind of the basic requirement. It is something that you would just give to a developer, right? So to scaffold an initial implementation of what you want to do, right? In this case, we'll treat in ChatGPT as that peer developer that can help us create the initial boilerplate code for this. So let's go with that and see what ChatGPT can create for us. All right, so we got an answer here. So let's scroll up and let's take a quick look at what it generated. So it indeed generated a controller, right? A match controller. It included kind of a list of matches, right? Which makes sense. So this is the list of matches that are going to be available. And then it created this match endpoint that responds to the API/match/player endpoint. Notice that it even includes the player as part of the route. That player is going to receive it as a parameter. And then it's going to have this logic here, very simple, that says, okay, let's try to find a match where player 2 is empty. That means that will be an open match, right? If there's a match that just has one player, means that player 2 is empty. It means that we do have an open match, right? So if that is the case, that is this step here. It says, well, let's assign the player to player 2 and then just return that open match. Notice that it even adds some comments here regarding what we're trying to do over there, which is super handy. And then otherwise, if the open match is null, it means that, well, there is no open match, right? So then we have to go ahead and say, okay, so new match with player 1, right? The parameter that we provided, we add that to the matches array, and then we just return that a new match. And then it even generates this game match class that we can use as kind of either our entity or our DO that we want to return back to the client. And not only that, it even gives you a very nice explanation of everything that's going on with that code that it generated if you wanted to get that. So this is very handy. Sometimes it is just too verbose and it just makes it so it takes more time than needed to provide you with the answer, but it is super handy so to understand what's going on there. Okay, so this will work, I think, just fine as a starting point. But these days, as you may know, we do have this new framework called Minimal APIs that can generate a slightly smaller code, right? So that you don't have to use boilerplate code like controllers, right? And it's just a much better and nicer experience to get started. And so what I'd like to do here is to actually ask ChatGPT to switch to minimal APIs, right? So what I'm going to say is just, well, use minimal APIs instead of a controller. All right, so let's hit enter and let's see what we get. All right, so we got our code and let it keep explaining. So while that happens, let's scroll up and see what we got this time. So indeed, notice that it says that yeah, it's going to generate a code for minimal APIs that was introduced in .NET 6, right? And so as you can see, yeah, this is indeed a program CS that complies with the minimal APIs or the minimal framework. And so it is defining our get endpoint over here that again, it is match player, where player is going to be part of the route. And then it's the same code as before, but now it is part of this simplified get endpoint right there. Okay, it even gives a name to the endpoint, yeah, and then it defines the game match class right there. Okay, and just as before, it also provides explanation of everything that is going on there. So I think this looks like good enough for us to get started. So let's see if this code is actually going to work. So what I'm going to do is first we need to define this game match class over here. So let's go back into our code over here, and you don't have to do things exactly as ChatGPT asks us to do. So I like to look at it as an assistant to my code rather than a thing that can write exactly the code that I need. So what I like to do, instead of just putting the class directly in program CS, I'm going to create a folder here, and I'm going to be calling it entities. Okay, and then in this one, I'm going to create a brand new C# file that is going to be a class. It's going to be our game match class right there. And here we're going to copy that code that ChatGPT generated. So this one here, the public class game match, I'm going to copy that. And then back here, and let me actually convert this into file scope namespace so we can see better, like that. And then let's paste that over here, right? So here we have our game match class. Now we are getting a couple of warnings here. This is kind of a nullable warnings here because of course you should not have, player might be null after creating an instance of game match, right? We have not said that this is going to be a nullable, right? And so we can do a couple of things here. So player one, what we can do is just say that this is going to be required, right? And this is kind of a new feature in the latest version of .NET 7, I think, or the latest version of C#, right? And so that makes sure that whoever creates an instance of game match has to provide a value for player one, which makes sense. Otherwise, you could not create a game match. Now for player two, this is not really required because we can totally have a match with no player two until player two comes into play. So for this one, we're just going to add a question mark here, which turns this property into a nullable property. All right. So that kind of fixes that game match class right there. And I'm going to remove this here. Now let's go back into ChatGPT and let's copy the rest of the code. So we have up here, we are defining the matches array. So let's copy that and let's go to program CS. Let's go ahead and define it over here. We'll have to do a control dot over here to use matchmaker.entities. All right. So and then back here, let's go ahead and we don't have to use all the code. So this is all so that we can use Swagger, but we don't need to use that right now. So let's not bother about that. Let's just copy the actual endpoint, which is the main part here. And even with names, that would be fine. So let's copy that code and let's replace our hello world with that code that ChatGPT generated. Let's make this a bit smaller so we can see better. Okay, simple piece of code. Let's close this with a semicolon there. And then, yeah, so that should work for our initial endpoint, right? And so, well, let's test it out, right? So let me open the terminal here and let me switch to my matchmaker directory. And then let's just go ahead and run this project and see what we get. Okay, so the server is up and running. And what we need now is just some way to test this endpoint, right? So what I'm going to do is just create a brand new file here. Let's call it matchmaker.http. And this is a file where we can go ahead and declare any of the requests that we want to make into our REST API. Now, in order to use this kind of file, all you have to do in your VS Code installation is, and I'm going to open my extensions view over here. So just look for REST client, this REST client extension, right? Which is this one, the first one here by Juan Chao Mao. And this one you can use to do all of your testing of REST APIs directly in VS Code, right? So I already have it installed, close that. And so here what we can do is just say, well, I want to do a GET request into, and we can see the location of our server down here. Okay, it's right here, localhost 5290. So let me copy that and I'll paste that over there. And then what is going to be the endpoint? Where the endpoint, if we go back into program CS, is going to be right here. Okay, so let me copy that and let's paste that over there. And then we have to provide some sort of a player, right? So let's say that the player is going to be just player one, doesn't really matter. So it's going to be player one. And let me collapse that over there so we can see better. And then let's send a request and see what we get. Okay, so let's collapse this. And then indeed, we are getting what we expected. We have a player one, and then we have a player two, which is null right now. And so yeah, so we have a match, looks like. And then if we say, let's say player two in this case, I'll send request. And as you can see, now we have a match with both player one and player two. And so as you can see, just by asking ChatGPT, we already have some sort of functional code up and running without having to come up with initial boilerplate code. So this is way better than any what any template can do for you. But that being said, there could be still some issues going on here. So let's say what happens if I ask for a match for player one once again. So I hit send request, and looks like it did create another match. I mean, we're not sure because we actually don't have any information about matches here. It's just player one and player two. But as you can see, now we have player one, and then we don't have a player two over here. So what we want to do now likely is to assign some sort of ID to the match, just so we can see if we are actually reusing. We should be reusing the same match if the player is asking for a match once again, right? Plus, we should prevent issues where the player may want to assign to himself. So let's see what happens if we do player one once again. So I'm going to say send request. And as you can see, now player one is getting matched to himself. So that doesn't make much sense, right? So let's go back to ChatGPT over here and let's specify a new set of requirements, right? So let's say, well, add an ID to game match. That will be handy. And then let's also say that, and add a match state with values. And this is because we may need to track the state of the match, right, over time, right, to see the progress of the match, right? Since the moment when it doesn't have any opponent for the player, then we will have a match found for that player. So we have player one and player two, and eventually we will get into a state where the actual game is ready for the players to go, right? So let's say that we want to have a match state, with which values that could be, let's say, waiting for opponent. And then another state will be match found. And the last state, let's say it's going to be game ready. So let's go with that and let's see what we get now. All right, so yeah, it's still explaining, but let's look at this updated code. So indeed, it has now generated a variable here to just keep track of the latest match ID, which works just fine. And then if we scroll down, we're going to see that it is using that match ID and even incrementing it anytime it creates a match, which is great. Plus, if we scroll down to the right, we're going to see that now we have a match state defined for that match. It initializes it with the very first value, which is waiting for opponent. And then if you go to the left and scroll down once again, we're going to see that, yeah, we have an updated game match class, which now has the ID. It has the ID, it has the match state, and even it defines the enum for the match state, which is very impressive. All right, so let's take these updated elements into our code and see how that works. So I'm going to copy the match state over here. I'm going to close this, and perhaps I'll just stop my server, Control-C, it is stopped. So I'll go back into game match, and just to keep things simple, I'm going to define the enum just here next to the class right there. And then going back here, I'm going to define our updated game match. So we're just going to be adding the ID, right? So I generated an ID right there, and then it also defined this state, right? So I'm going to be adding that state right here. Okay, and lastly, we have a new implementation. So I'm going to grab the updated implementation from here, copy that into our program CS, I'm going to paste that over here. Now we have our updated implementation, and we're missing that a new next match ID that it defined it just under the matches list right there. And yeah, this should do it, right? So let's go ahead and test this out. So I'm going to do again .NET run. Okay, and I'll collapse this back into this place, and I'm going to just go ahead and send request. And as you can see, now we have our match ID, we have our match state over there, and then if we say, well, let's try with player 2. Okay, we can see that player 2 and player 1 are in the same ID match with ID 1. But if I go in and say player 1 again, this is actually assigning player 1 to a new match, which is not what we want. We wanted to just reuse the previous one, right? And furthermore, we know that if you just keep calling it, it's just going to keep assigning things to the same match. It also looks like the match state is changing, which is great. Also, we are looking at numbers here, right? So usually you will expect to have some sort of a name for the enum over here as opposed to the number. Okay, so let's see if we can provide more requirements into ChatGPT so that we can improve this logic here. So let's go back into ChatGPT. Let's scroll down. The first thing we want to ask is that, well, if the player is in a match, just reuse or return that match. So if the player is already in a match, well, return that match. All right, let's see what we get this time. All right, so we got our updated code here. And so if you take a quick look, we're going to see that, yeah, we have this new code block right there, right? Well, which what it's doing, it is just trying to see if there is an existing match for that player, right? Just by using a very simple link statement in there. And if it can find a match, it will just go ahead and return it, right? Otherwise, it just proceeds with the previous implementation, which looks great. So, so that's awesome. But then also we said that we don't want to be returning these enum values as integers, but actually as the name of the enum, right? As the name of each of these values, right? So let's see if we can also ask ChatGPT to do something about that. So we're going to say serialize the match state as a string instead of a number, all right? So let's see what ChatGPT can do there for us. All right, and I think we got it because as you can see here, and now the match state includes a JSON converter, right? The JSON string enum converter that is going to take care of serializing that enum as a string as opposed to a number. So that is so that's great, right? So let's try out this new code. So I'm just going to copy the endpoint code right there. I'm going to copy and close this. And let me stop my server for a moment. Let's go back to program CS and let's copy our updated get code over here so that we can check for existing matches. And then let's scroll down and copy this updated match state, which has the JSON converter. I'm going to copy that over here, right there. Okay, now for this, and let me actually add one line here. I'll do control dot. We can import a system.text.json.serialization. That's going to take care of adding what's missing in there. All right, so with that, we should start getting closer to what we want. So let's go ahead and run the server once again. And now I'll collapse this back here. Let's go ahead and see what happens if we ask for a match for player 1. Okay, so as you can see, now we have a match state that is the string version of the enum. So that's awesome. And then let's ask for player 2. Let's see what happens if we send player 2. So yeah, now we have player 1 and player 2. And now the match state has switched into game ready. Now this is not actually expected. I didn't expect it to have game ready. So that's not the exact state that we want. But we're still getting the names as opposed to the int values, right? So it's okay. We're going to fix that. But let's check the other thing, which is what happens if we request for player 1 once again, right? So I'll hit send request. And then as you can see, even if I hit this, I keep getting the same match, which is match number 1. So we are no longer letting the code create a brand new match anytime an existing player requests that he wants to join a match, right? He's already in a match. And because of that, it can also happen that a player is signing to himself. So if we go with player 3, for instance, so yeah, that makes sense. That's going to be a brand new match. But if we say player 3 once again, it's going to just remain there, right? So I just keep clicking, and player 3 remains in that match, right? So it's not assigning himself, so that works great. Now let's take a quick look at what happened with that match state, because it is not getting exactly what we wanted to. So let's go back into program CS and let's see what's happening here. So basically, yeah, so if it's an existing match, it will be returned. Otherwise, we try to find an open match, right? And then if there is an open match, we are changing the state into game ready. That's not accurate. So it should be actually match found. So match found is the state that we want over there. So let's see, actually, let's ask ChatGPT and see if he can fix that issue for us, right? So what we're going to say is, if an open match is found, switch the match state to match found, right? And yeah, let's go with that, see what happens. All right, so we got our updated implementation here, and if we scroll up, let's see, yeah, I think we did it. As you can see, open match state is going to be match found in the case where an open match is found. So I'm just going to copy actually just that line over there. Let's switch to the code and let's paste that over here. All right, and so this should be pretty much what we wanted. So let's run once again our server over there, and let's test this out. So I'm going to go with player 1. Okay, so yeah, so waiting for opponent, and then I'll go with player 2, and that will give us match found, as you can see right here. Okay, and so yeah, so this is great. I think this REST API is pretty much doing what we wanted to this point. We still have to look into the game ready state later on. We'll look into that later. But for now, what's happening right now is actually that you know, I'm getting a little bit tired of testing every single case manually right now for this logic here, because we have quite a bit of some logic in there, right? If we go back in the program CS, we know that we have the conditions that are happening across these little methods over there. So naturally, what we want to do now is to introduce some sort of unit testing into this code here, right, to validate for all of these scenarios. And so once again, we could either go ahead and start creating those unit tests from scratch, or we can go ahead and ask ChatGPT to generate those tests for us. Okay, now for doing that, what I'd like to do is to actually separate this code from our minimal API endpoint here and into another class that is specifically designed to handle the matching of players, right? So I usually don't like to be having all of this code directly into either the endpoint or the controller action, because these endpoints and actions are really designed to, the only responsibility of them should be just receive a request and then delegate whatever has to happen into some other component, and that component does the job and then returns a result that we just return back into the client via the endpoint, right? But we should not have all this logic here. It just makes it harder to unit test. So what I'd like to do is just to ask ChatGPT to generate another class for me where with all this code, and to use dependency injection to inject that instance of that class into this endpoint here. So let's see if we can do that. So let's go back to ChatGPT over here, and let's ask it to move the matching logic to another class and use the I to inject it into the endpoint. All right, let's go. Right, so let's see what we got this time. Scroll up once again, and as we can see, the code looks much simpler from the endpoint point of view now. And what's happening is that indeed we do have a matchmaker component now. So if you scroll down actually here, you're going to see that we have this brand new class called matchmaker, which now has this match async method, whose only job is to go ahead and do the matchmaking, right? So we have isolated the entire logic into matchmaker over here. And then if we scroll up here, we're going to see that we are adding that matchmaker as a singleton here. And we are doing dependency injection into the map get endpoint right here to inject an instance over there. And then we're using that to perform the match, right, the actual match, and then we return that game match back into the client, right? So just by asking ChatGPT, we were able to turn this into a proper pattern of moving that logic into another class that is now going to be easier to test. Now, a couple of things to notice here is that it did use the name matchmaker for the class itself, which happens to be the same name as our namespace and the directory that we're using for this microservice. So we may not want to be using that name here. So we perhaps we want to change that. Also, it is not using an interface to define this class. So this class is just there, not implementing an interface, right? And so we're injecting, we're registering the singleton directly with the class name as opposed to the interface. And so that potentially can make our endpoint harder to test later on, right? If we wanted to do that. So perhaps we can ask ChatGPT to improve this a little bit, right? So let's say rename matchmaker to match service and make it use an interface, right? Let's see what happens then. All right, so let's take a quick look at the new implementation. As you can see, now we have match service over here, and it is implementing our brand new iMatch service interface, which I don't know if it actually defined. Let me take a quick look here. Yeah, here's the interface also defined right there. Okay, which makes sense. And then it even uses that interface to register the instance of match service. And we're also receiving that instance right here as a parameter to the endpoint, right? So it is exactly what I was looking for. And notice that we didn't have to give too much instruction to ChatGPT so that it can come up with this. So this is actually great. So what we're going to do is just go back to our code over here, and I'm going to show my Explorer. And let's go ahead and create a brand new directory. Let's call it services. And in this one, let's go ahead and create our brand new interface, which is going to be iMatch service right there. And so going back here, let's go ahead and copy the code for our interface. Copy that. Yeah, let's change it into a file scope namespace, right? And put this here. Okay, so we're going to need to import, so control dot matchmaker entities. Let's also clean up these unnecessary namespaces. And so yeah, there we have our interface. Let's now go ahead and create our class, right, which is the match service. We're going to do the same thing, just do file scope namespace, remove necessary usings, and then let's scroll down here to copy our full implementation of the match service class right there. I'll copy that. Okay, and we'll replace this over here. Okay, let's collapse this for a moment. And then let's see, we do need to do control dot here to import a matchmaker.entities right there. And then, yeah, this is looking really good. And then let's also complete this by going now into our program CS, right? So over here, we're going to have to do this registration, right? So I'll copy that, program CS. Okay, we can do that just under the definition of builder. We're going to say builder.services.add_singleton, and that's going to be iMatch service. I'll do control dot here to use matchmaker.services. All right, so we have registered the instance, and then we go down into the definition of our endpoint. I'll copy that. And then instead of having all of that logic here, we're going to replace that with this very little logic over there. And as you can see, yeah, so match service is injected here, dependency injection. And then, yeah, this will work just fine. Although we don't need to do that much. I mean, we can do this in one line by just saying, yeah, so return. Yeah, we return that. And that should do it. Okay, we also don't need this next match ID over here. And now our endpoint is just a one-liner, as you can see. All of the logic is now living in match service over here. Now notice that it did generate an async method for our match async here, which is not something that we need right now. That's why we have this warning here, right? It's saying that where is your await? Where are your tasks? We don't need it now because everything is in memory, right? But we will need this later on when we start thinking about how we're going to communicate with the other microservice. And so for now, what we can do is just say, for the returns, we're going to say task.fromResult, right? And then we're going to put our open match right there. And then we'll have to say, oh, wait, task from result, right? Same thing we're going to do over here like that. All right. And so what that does is just creates a kind of a little task over there to return that result, even when we don't really need the use of a task. We'll change that later on when we actually need to start doing async operations. But for now, this is looking good. And I think we should be able to go ahead and test this and see if it's still working just fine. So let's go ahead and do .NET Run. Okay, and let's collapse this back here. Let's test this with player 1, send request. And yeah, the result is looking good. I'll do player 2. And then, yeah, we have a match found and everything is working just as before. Okay. But now remember that the reason why we wanted to do this is because we want to do some good unit testing, right, of this class. And I'm going to just stop my server over there. And so now that we have match service isolated, we can go ahead and focus all of our unit testing specifically into this one class here, and specifically in the match async method over here. And so for that, the first thing that we're going to need is, of course, some sort of unit test project, right? So I'm going to open my terminal over here. And I'm going to go up one directory, and then I'm just going to say .NET New XUnit, which is a framework that I'd like to use these days. And then the name is going to be matchmaker.unittests, right? And so, yeah, so the project is created. And if we see on the left side, we can see that now we have our brand new matchmaker unit test project over there. And one thing that I'm going to do is I'm just going to use, since I am in VS Code, I'm going to be using this setting down here, right there, to switch the context of my project into the testing project, right? So I'm just going to click there, and I'm going to select matchmaker.unittests.csproc, and that's just to notify OmniSharp, which is driving all the intelligence and productivity in my editor over here, so that it knows that I'm working over there, and it should provide me feedback into the code that I'm writing in that new project. Okay, and so yeah, so now we have that, and one thing that we're going to need right away, let's do that, is a reference from the unit test project into my matchmaker project over there. So I'm going to switch into matchmaker.unittest, and I'll just do .NET add reference into matchmaker.csproc. All right, so that's great. And so now we are pretty much ready to write our unit test. But like I said, instead of coming up with our test, and here's our initial test class, instead of trying to come up with actual scenarios that we need to test, let's see if ChatGPT can help us there and provide at least some initial set of unit tests that we can use here. So let's go back into ChatGPT. Let's go all the way to the end. And let's ask it, well, generate unit tests for match service. All right, so hit enter and let's see what we get. All right, so we got our test generated. So let's take a quick look. I see 1, 2, 3, 4 tests here, and yeah, so let's go ahead and let's just copy this here. And these are, by the way, XUnit tests, which I mean I got lucky. I mean ChatGPT will offer something that works, and that could be in this case XUnit, it could be NUnit, it could be MS test. Like I said, you could get different responses here, and so but all of them will be valid, right? And so if it didn't give you XUnit test, you could say, hey, rewrite this with unit test, right? So which is pretty cool. So now what I'm going to do is just copy. Let's just copy this and let's take a look at what got generated in VS Code. So I'm copy that into here, right there. Okay, and let's just rename our file name here from unit test 1 into match service tests.cs. All right, and I'll collapse this. And then let me just click over here in match service, control dot, so that we can use matchmaker.services right there. And then scroll down, we likely want to click in match state, control dot, and let's use matchmaker.entities. And I think that's going to take care of all of the warnings or errors over here. So now you gotta be careful with this because even when ChatGPT will do a great effort on generating a unit test, valid unit test for your scenarios, from my experience, these tests, many times they're just not going to pass. I mean, they're close, but they are not 100% accurate, right? So use this as an initial boilerplate for your test, but not as something that will right away generate all the tests that you're going to need. So let's take a quick look at each of these tests and make sure that they make sense. So for this first test, it says, well, match async with new player creates new match, right? And notice that, I mean, to start with, the convention of this name here is actually pretty good. I mean, it has all of the parts that you should be using in your unit test, meaning what is the unit under test, which in this case is match async, right? That first part. The second part is under what state. In this state, the state right now is when there's a new player. That's the scenario, right? And then what is the expectation of this? The expectation is creates new match, right? So this name is great, and that by itself is a super helpful thing that's coming out of ChatGPT. And not only that, it is using the AAA pattern over here to define the implementation of the test. So arrange, which is where we prepare things for the unit test, and then act, which is where we actually execute the action that we want to test, and finally assert, which is where we validate the things that we want to validate about this test. So this, again, this is a fantastic way to define a unit test, and it did it all by itself. Okay, so now let's see what's going on. So first we define an instance of match service, which is great. And then we're going to go ahead and say, okay, so let's match Alice. Let's match Alex and get a game match. And then all this validating is that player one should have Alice right there, which makes sense because it is a brand new match. And then the state should be waiting for opponent, right? Which also makes sense. So this test looks good to me. So let's move on to the next one. The next one says, well, match async with an existing player should return an existing match. Okay, so let's see what happens. So it's similar to the one before. So we have a match for Alice, and then what it is doing is just say, well, go ahead and try to match Alice once again, right? So getting a new game match, and then those two matches should be basically, well, the same match, right? Because Alice was already in that match over there. So yeah, that unit test is making sense to me, so that looks good. Let's keep going down and let's see this other test over here. Now this one says match async with open match matches players, right? So this is the case where we do have an open match and we want to assign another player to that same match. So let's see. Okay, so we get a first match, Alice match right there. And then we are trying to match Bob, right, with somebody, right? So we're getting another game match over here. So in this case, expectation is that we still should have this Alice match and game match should be basically the same match, right? Because they are being both players are assigned into the same match. And so yeah, so the idea of both matches should match. Player one should be Alice, player two should be Bob, makes sense. And then the assertion here should be that, yeah, the state should be match found, right? Because we have the two players in there. So yeah, I mean, once again, this test is looking great. So let's go ahead and look at the last test case here. So let's see. So this one says, well, match async with no open match creates a new match. Now this test case here, so let me compare this very quickly with the first one that we have here, right? So remember that the first one says match async with new player creates a new match. So really, I mean, this is pretty much the same thing as this one over here, right? I mean, it is a new player or it is there's no open match. I think it's the same thing, right? I think it is great that it's trying to cover an additional case here, but I don't think we really need to go that far. So I'm actually going to go ahead and get rid of these unit tests over here. Okay, so that's that. And then, well, let's run this test and see if it works. So what I'm going to do is just click over here where it says run all tests, this icon over here. I'll click on that and let's see what we get. All right, and we got 3 out of 3 passing, right? And so we have a fully working set of unit tests. I have to say I'm fairly impressed here because in the previous runs, when I tried to do this before, ChatGPT will not produce, it will produce 1 out of 3 tests valid, like just 1 valid and 2 invalid. But in this case, somehow it managed to produce 3 fully working unit tests, which is awesome. But like I said, don't just trust this test right away. You have to go ahead and validate that everything that's going on there actually makes sense. Okay, so now we have our REST API up and running. We have unit tests, so we are ready to start creating matches for our players. And I hope that was useful. And we'll stop here for now, and in my next video we'll go over the implementation of our second microservice, the Game Manager, and this time we'll be using another pretty awesome AI tool that is as good or even better than ChatGPT. And trust me, you don't want to miss that one. So, well, for now, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.